Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here online and in person. So let me introduce our project and some points of our project very briefly. First of all, I'd like to talk about sorry, I will not talk. I will talk, but without slides. So basically, as Iga has already mentioned, one of the main points of our project was to use administrative data to evaluate the effectiveness of alternative programs for youth in these four countries, the alternative policies. So I'll introduce the policy context, and I'll also talk about some of our more interesting and more important results. One thing to note is that not only did we use administrative data to evaluate youth employment policies, but we also started doing randomized control trials, and we'll not talk about that right now, but some of our panelists might have a word to say about that. So let me just very briefly summarize the policy context where we stand, right? Most of youth employment policies are within the framework or associated to the framework of the Youth Guarantee in Europe. Now, of course, the Youth Guarantee has the goal of offering support to all those who need it, but at the same time to offer tailor-made support. So to try to do the best to tailor-make the policies to the needs of the young person. Obviously, this is a rather difficult and complicated task, and the reinforced youth guarantee, or the bridge to jobs, actually emphasized the distinction between temporary and long-term needs. Now, in order to be able to tailor-make or target the policies to the youth who need it the most, obviously we need to understand which policies work and for whom and in which context. So this is what we try to do in our countries, in our research. And the other thing that we need to understand is how our policies assigned right now. So if they are not necessarily assigned in the most effective way, we need to map how they are assigned right now and why. Okay? Now, continuing a little bit further in the role of the Youth Guarantee or the policy context, we all know that the Youth Guarantee has helped a lot of young people between 200 up to 36 or above 36 million young people between 2014 and 2019. Yet, we do not have very well organized knowledge of which policies work for whom. Of course, there are some counterfactual impact evaluations that have been done, but we do not have a clear view of those impact evaluations. Now, of course, you all know that there are many types of labor policies and many types of active labor market policies. In our project, we tended to focus most on what is called hiring incentives, whereby the firms get some kind of support to recruit young, disadvantaged, or vulnerable young people. So our work tended to concentrate on these types of policies. Now, the last thing that I would like to point out is that obviously different countries and different regions struggle with, or young people in different countries struggle with different kinds of problems. In some countries, and I'll focus more on those, there are vulnerable young people who are not able to enter the formal labor market and are stuck in a NEET status for a relatively long time. While in some other countries and for other young groups, the issue is that they are able to enter the labor market, but they end up in jobs that are very bad jobs, and they cycle between NEET status and very bad jobs, temporary jobs. Okay, so this was the policy context. Now, what did we set out to do? We set out to use administrative data. Now, why is using administrative data a big promise? Well, it is a big promise because these kinds of data, for example, data that the Public Employment Service collects, that the Social Security collects, they are in principle readily available, and they can be accessed for a large number of young people. They cover a relatively long perspective, so we can take a look at the outcomes of young people over a long perspective, and the data collection costs are not as prohibitively high as for survey data. And last but not least, and maybe this is extremely important for young people, in principle, different alternative data sets can be linked across one another. Hopefully, for young people, even their labor market outcomes can be also linked to their school transitions, and hence we can, in principle, observe the whole school to work transition. So administrative data have a lot of advantages and have a lot of promises. Now, what did we set out to do? We set out to do counterfactual impact evaluations. So what is the point of counterfactual impact evaluations? We would like to know what would have happened to these young people had they not enrolled in the programs that they ended up in. Okay, so what would have been their fate, or what would have been their outcomes had they not received hiring subsidies, had they not enrolled into the Youth Guarantee program. Now, this is a difficult task because obviously we would have to infer something from data, what would have happened in the absence of the program. And this is complicated by the fact that the people who choose to enter these programs are typically different than those who choose not to enter these programs. Either they are already in the past, they have had better or worse outcomes than those who choose not to enter the programs, or they think that they will benefit from these programs more than those who choose not to enter these programs. So this is a relatively difficult task, but we used administrative data to try to disentangle what would have been the effect of these programs. Now, let me point out a couple of things that were specific to our work and which is specific to the work of people who are working right now in Europe about policies targeted at youth. The specificity is that we are working in the context of the Youth Guarantee. Now, why does that pose an issue, or what kind of questions does that pose for us when we are trying to disentangle the effect of these policies? Well, the first question is whether we need to consider the Youth Guarantee as a whole package, or whether we can take bits and pieces of that Youth Guarantee and evaluate those different programs one by one. That's a big question from the point of view of the research. Now, the second question is whether we need to consider the Youth Guarantee as basically more of the same, or whether we need to consider it as a completely different program. In other words, whether we can, when we try to take a look at the effect of these policies on a certain age group, whether we are able to compare their outcomes with people who are slightly older. This is, again, a question that we had to face when we were doing our research. And last but not least, if we are trying to look at the age group that is targeted by the Youth Guarantee, because in principle, in the Youth Guarantee, everybody is supposed to get an offer, then the question is, when we are trying to look at one particular program or a set of programs, to what other programs or to what other baseline status should we compare these programs to? Because in principle, there is no such person who does not get any valid support. Or there are some groups who do not get any very beneficial support, but these groups are very particular, either because they are young people who do not choose to get support, or they are young people who cannot get support from the public employment services due to health problems, for instance. 4 different kinds of programs relative to, not the absence of participation, but relative to participation in public works, or in other words, directly created government jobs. Basically, they found that public works do not seem to work, but all these other programs have a beneficial effect relative to public works. But unfortunately, these positive effects tend to fade out relatively quickly. So the beneficial effects of these different programs tend to fade out over 1.5 to 2 year period. So that was the main result of the evaluation for Poland. And then let me proceed a bit more in depth about the program that we evaluated in Hungary. It was a specific program because it gave employers the chance to recruit youngsters for a relatively short period in time. That means 3 months. And employers had no obligation to retain these young workers after the public subsidy ran out. Now, again, in Hungary, the natural choice to compare the participation in this program was a comparison group who come from public work participation. And again, the main conclusion was that relative to public works participation, this short-term hiring subsidy or wage subsidy had positive effects both on youngsters' employment and labor income. However, again, in this program, positive effects tended to fade out. So we were at this point where I was discussing the results of the Job Trial program, and now I would like to go into a cautionary tale about the targeting of youth guarantee in Hungary, but also I presume this is a tiny bit. This is also an issue in Poland. What would I like to speak about? The point is that in this particular hiring program, but more widely in the youth guarantee, what we observed is that it is actually the young people who are closer to the labor market, who are less vulnerable, who are assigned to these programs within the youth guarantee, while more vulnerable people are assigned to public works participation. And this is very similar in Poland. And actually, our colleagues from Poland also showed that the public works participation is particularly disadvantageous for people who are living in high unemployment areas and who have low education. But in fact, these are the areas where young people are assigned to a larger extent to public works. We observed the same kind of pattern in Hungary, where those people who end up in hiring subsidies are positively selected. They have higher education outcomes, and so on and so forth. So this kind of assignment mechanism is not consistent with the objectives of the youth guarantee, and especially not consistent with the objectives of the reinforced youth guarantee. So we have to think about the mechanisms whereby less vulnerable people, why more vulnerable people do not end up in these relatively successful programs. And we presume, or we assume, that part of the reason why this is happening is that very often the monitoring indicators that different public employment services and the different member states use for monitoring the effectiveness of the youth guarantee is based on raw employment outcomes, which is very different than the beneficial effect of a particular policy or the youth guarantee in general, because in particular, higher educated young people tend to have much better employment outcomes, but the effect or the effectiveness of the youth guarantee or the programs within the youth guarantee tend to be higher, or at least as high, for more vulnerable young people. So this is a cautionary tale about the youth guarantee. I will unfortunately have to go very quickly on my next slide, which is about our results for Italy and Spain. In Italy, the main issue is the conversion of temporary contracts for young people to more open-ended contracts, and our colleagues evaluated a policy which gave social security rebates to companies who are transferring temporary contracts into open-ended contracts, and our colleagues found that these kinds of policies were particularly effective for young people. Our colleagues in Spain also tried to evaluate a hiring type of program where the point was also to get some kind of on-the-job training in order to serve as an entry into a more permanent position. But unfortunately, employers in Spain did not use it in the intended way, did not use this construction in the intended way. Actually, they used it to extend the period over which the young person was in temporary contracts. Now, I don't have too much time to dwell on that, and I will wrap up very briefly. So what we wanted to say is that administrative data are becoming widely available for researchers, and they are a very good tool to evaluate the policies within the youth guarantee. Second is that our evaluations tended to show that those people for whom, or those young people for whom these policies tend to be more effective, do not tend to end up in large numbers in these policies. So there is an issue with the assignment mechanism of these policies. And in particular, and I would like to tie into some of the other points that we will raise later on this afternoon, is that the youth guarantee is not particularly successful in reaching out to young persons from a vulnerable background, and in particular, it seems not at all successful in reaching out to young women who are raising small children, which is going to be an especially important issue with the extension of the youth guarantee to the 25 to 29 year old group. Okay, and last but not least, why is the assignment mechanism not necessarily working in the way that it might be intended? Well, because we can show in our effectiveness studies that the impact or the positive effect of the program is very different than the raw outcome, the raw employment outcomes of young people. And when we are thinking about targeting policies, we should think about the impact of the policies, not the raw employment outcomes of the young people who participate in these measures. Thank you very much, and we will go to the panel.